Hi, this is the topic following the introduction. In my weird logic, I call this topic 2, which means the introduction was topic 1. And today we're going to be looking at a brief history of the philosophy of mind. And if you notice me looking upwards, I've got my notes on the desktop, which is above the laptop, which I'm recording on. So occasionally I have to look up to remind myself of what I've forgotten to talk about, but mostly I should be able to talk directly to you. Okay, so why talk about philosophy of mind at the start of a course like this? And the reason is we're going to trace the development of thinking about the human mind and how it works from the time of the ancient Greeks, 2,500 years ago, to now, 2021. And we're going to see why biology was removed from psychology back in the early to middle 20th century. We're going to see how the behavioural psychology people developed, when they developed in the beginning of the 20th century, and the effect that they had on the development of learning theory. And then we're going to look at why biology was put back into psychology. And moving on. Now, why European philosophy? Well, I mean, philosophy developed all over the world, on every continent, around about the same time, 2,500 years ago. There was a great flowering of philosophers and thinking about the human mind and human condition. However, the view of psychology that we have is based on the Western philosophy of mind, starting with the ancient Greeks. And we will then take a look at the contents this particular topic. We're going to be looking at 2,500 years of thinking about the mind. And we're going to start with antiquity. Then we're going to look at the Dark and Middle Ages, and then the Age of Enlightenment, and modernism, postmodernism, and today. Well, antiquity started around 2,500 years ago, and probably go up to about 500 AD or whatever label you want to put on it. We'll say 1,500 years ago, and maybe 1,700 years ago. And the Dark and Middle Ages were from there to 400 years ago, 700 years ago. And from there up to the early 19th century, when modernism started, and then up to the middle 20th century, when postmodernism started, and now what we have today, which is the putting back of biology into psychology. And before we start with the ancient Greeks, we'll take a look at what happened with the human race before that. And the hominins have been around for 2 million years. When I say hominins, the Homo sapiens is just the latest version of hominin, but there were many, probably about 15 different species of hominin that existed between 2 million years ago and about 20,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens appeared initially around about 250,000 years ago. And language developed about 100,000 years ago. And we developed sky gods, and then agriculture appeared about 10,000 years ago. And with that came civilization and the belief that gods cause natural phenomena. So we have, going way back to the, actually sky gods didn't start with agriculture. Sky gods were invented long before that. And of course, the reason for that, put in a nutshell, was that human beings developed the faculty when we started developing large, intelligent brains. We developed the faculty for wanting to know why things are, what's causing them. We need to know what the cause is, because whether we lived or died depended upon what was the thing that was coming towards us and what their intentions were. So we needed to, if things were happening in the environment, we needed to attribute causes to them, and a cause in terms of somebody causing this. And where natural phenomena were concerned, it was put down to sky gods. And then, of course, that was also applied to human activities and events as well. Now, before 2 million years ago, before we branched off from the chimpanzee, what came to be, or what we would now call chimpanzees. In fact, they weren't chimpanzees back then. There were the pre-chimpanzees and the pre-hominins. Now, at about 2 million years ago, the chimpanzees went on their branch, they went off on their direction, and the hominins went on a different direction. As far as the species went, the evolution of this relative species. Before that, we all belonged to the same species, which was a form of great ape. Okay, so that brings us down to today, and to antiquity. So antiquity, the antiquity we're looking at was the ancient Greeks around 2,500 years ago. And before that time, they were very interested in exploring natural things, material things, material events, and maybe even medicine for that matter, like the body. But they really weren't concerned about the mind. And then around about 2,500 years ago, they decided, I don't know how, but people started to think seriously about what is the human mind, where is it, and how does it work. They knew that the mind, or they believed that the mind caused behaviour, and that the mind was in the soul. Now, their sort of soul isn't the Christian soul, which is immortal. Their soul was simply a non-material element of a human being. So we have a material element and a non-material element. And somehow the material element sent messages to the non-material element, and the non-material element sent messages back to the material element, or you might say body and soul. How that actually happened, no one had worked out, and they still hadn't worked it out right up until the middle of the 20th century. However, in ancient Greece, there was one guy, and he was a bit of a maverick, and he actually believed that the mind was in the brain. So he was 2,500 years ahead of his time. He should have put off his birth a bit later. Okay. All right. Now, the Roman Empire. The Romans were great engineers and military people. However, they weren't interested in philosophy. If they wanted philosophy, they'd hire some Greeks, or they'd get some Greek slaves who had studied philosophy. And they let them do all the thinking for them and all the writing, although there were a few serious Greek philosophers and writers who thought about things, but not to the degree, the Roman philosophers and writers who thought seriously about things, but not to the same degree that the Greeks had. So the Romans were more interested in empire building and in building roads and great cities around the world, and of course great fortresses and walls and things, just to make sure that inside their empire everything was nice and peaceful, which, relatively speaking, it was compared to outside. Around about 1,700 years ago, towards the end of the Roman Empire, an emperor called Theodosius thought that if the empire had a single religion, then it would be much easier for him to govern the empire rather than have religions squabbling with each other. And he looked around and he said, which one will I choose? And he saw that the Christians were well organized. They had a good hierarchy, and they had a single set of beliefs, well, more or less. I mean, they weren't in complete agreement on what their beliefs were at that stage. They probably still are today. He said, well, the pagans are totally disorganized. There's no central authority with the pagans. It's just a question of what is appropriate to a particular family in a particular town, in a particular city, in a particular part of the world. So he thought, well, for stability's sake, the Christians would be the best mob because they had a central authority and they all believed more or less the same thing. So he chose the Christians as the state religion, Christianity as a state religion, and that eventually became the Catholic Church with its headquarters in Rome. And so going back a bit, and that led to papal power. Before the end of the Roman Empire, the emperors at the time gave to the Pope authority over certain sections of Italy. So that they were called the Papal States. So the Pope had his own army and his own source of revenue, like taxes. So to all of in intents and purposes, the Pope was like a king in his own right. Like a temporal king, a king that had power over the physical world. And after the fall of Rome, and of course Rome fell because the actual Romans themselves got soft. Their life was too good. They were too wealthy, too soft, and the non-Romans. What's going on here? Something just went beep, beep, beep. Okay. Oh, all right. We'll turn that one off. And the non-Romans started to take over the empire. In fact, at one stage, they had a barbarian emperor for a little while. He was one of the generals in their army. Most of the generals in their army were barbarians, and most of the soldiers were barbarians. Mind you, they weren't against the empire. They benefited from being part of the empire. However, the actual authority of the Romans themselves in the West, not so much in the East, that's in the empire still carried on in Constantinople, but before then they'd split. So they sort of had an emperor in Constantinople and an emperor in Rome. And the emperor in the empire in the West just decayed. It really wasn't defeated. It just decayed, and there was a pay dispute. And the barbarians who hadn't been paid said, "Oh well, we're going to get our money. We'll go and occupy Rome." So they just walked into Rome and sat there, and they didn't create too much havoc. They just made a nuisance of themselves until they got paid. And that went down in the history books as the fall of Rome. In fact, it wasn't an invasion at all. And after the fall of Rome, then Europe descended into anarchy and chaos, with tribe against tribe, and tribes pushing tribes out and taking over their territory. And the only sort of a central authority left in Europe was the papacy, was the Pope. All the other were small, well, relatively small tribal chiefdoms or kings, if you like. And they were too busy disagreeing with each other, but the Christian religion had spread throughout most of Europe by that stage. And a lot of the, I wouldn't say all, but a majority of people in Europe were Christians. So that meant that it was a good idea for these kings and chiefs, tribal chiefs, to keep the Pope on side. And eventually a lot of them converted to Catholicism themselves, more for political reasons and religious reasons, because it was a wise political move. And eventually the papacy grew in power and as far as being able to exercise control over these kings. And that lasted till about the 14 or 1500 years, AD. And around about the time of King Henry VIII, and we all know that King Henry VIII decided that he wanted to be the head of the church in his country, England. So he made himself the head of the church and sacked the Pope. But before that, or up to that time, the Pope was very powerful, and that was the only thing going. So as far as like education, all the education was done by the priests and monks. If you wanted to get educated, you had to go to a school controlled by priests and monks, and they worked on the Bible as the authority for everything. So there was no possibility of anyone having a free thought and coming up with new ideas. If it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, then it was heresy. So philosophers had to be very, very careful in those days. So all of their philosophies were more or less God-centered, and they had to look towards religion and God as the main driver of everything. But they did sort of little by little sort of carve out a niche for themselves, and eventually did manage to split from the theologians and set up their own branch without getting burnt at the stake as heretics. That was a long time. A lot of them actually did get burnt. The more outspoken ones did get burnt at the stake as heretics, until a guy called, just a minute, William of Ockham, who was an English Franciscan monk, friar, said, well, it doesn't make any sense at all to have science as part of theology. They needed to be separated. And he got away with this. He published this work, and he got away with it. They didn't accuse him of heresy, and they didn't burn him at the stake. So he was really sort of the father of the scientific method in Europe, as far as splitting from the authority of the Bible. And closely following him, or almost around about the same time, there was another guy called Roger Bacon, who was also a Franciscan friar, who delineated the foundations of the modern scientific method. In other words, what constitutes good science, as opposed to just opinion about things. Philosophers really deal in opinions. They're well thought out opinions, but they're still opinions nonetheless. They don't necessarily go out and look at the evidence, the hard evidence, the concrete evidence in the outside world. They think it all out in their head, which for some things is not a bad idea. It's just not really scientific. So Roger Bacon laid down the rules for conducting science, which outside theology and outside philosophy. And then we're off towards the Age of Enlightenment. So we're looking at the year the 1600s, and there were three guys in the 1600s that had a big effect on the philosophy of mind. One was a Frenchman called Rene Descartes, who still believed in a thing called dualism, which was the human beings consisted of a body and a soul. They were separate. Somehow the body and the soul communicated with each other, but no one quite knew how. And the mind, of course, was in the soul, not in the body. And then another guy who was a Spanish Jew who was a refugee in Holland. So he left Spain. There must have been through during one persecution or other, went to live in Holland. And in Holland, he decided he was going to be an atheist. Now, in that time, the 1600s, being an atheist was unheard of. It's like saying, I'm going to become a Martian. It was impossible not to believe in some God or other, be it the Catholic God or the Protestant God, or heaven forbid, the Muslim God. But you had to believe in some God. But he said, I'm not going to believe in God, and he got away. he didn't get executed. But he said the mind is in the brain. So that was a good start. So we're back to where that guy was, the lone voice amongst the ancient Greek philosophers, who said the mind is in the brain. I might just for interest's sake. Okay, here we go. The guy who said the name of the guy who said that the philosophy, the mind is in the brain, was a guy called Alcmason, Alcmacon, and he lived 2,500 years ago. So he was the only one. So Baruch Spinoza had brought us back to that point. And then another guy, an Englishman called Thomas Hobbes, came up with the idea that all the knowledge that we have is acquired by sense perception, which was quite radical in those days. I mean, we take it for granted now that if we learn something, it must have come through our eyes or ears or hands or whatever, or feet, or our skin. It's quite radical, because we're only just beginning to recognize that maybe the body has something to do with the brain. Okay. In the 1700s, there was a John Locke. I think one of them, can't remember which, was a Scotsman. Yeah, they're both in the United Kingdom. John Locke believed that the mind was a blank slate. In other words, you were born with a blank mind, and everything you are and know had to be written on that blank slate by experience. And David Hume came up with a theory. I don't know whether he was a blank slate person or not, but his theory said that behavior was caused by desire. So if we did something, then we must have had a desire to do it. There must be some sort of inner force. So we're sort of gradually edging towards modern psychology. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, we started with the age of modernism. And modernism, or getting towards the age of modernism. And modernism is the belief that if you're going to find out about mind and behavior, you had to refer to the evidence, the body, and actual behavior, and not just sitting in a room thinking about it. So they of course, it didn't just to do with the mind and behavior; it had to do with all the sciences. So modernism meant that we were going to start looking at the evidence. We're going to start weighing up whether the facts in the world that we see with our senses do agree with the theories that people have passed down from generation to generation via the mind. And during the 1800s, there were many philosophers writing about the mind and behavior. We haven't got time to go into them all, but if you are really interested, Google is not a bad starting point if you want to find out these things. And then around the middle of the 1800s, Charles Darwin appeared, and he shook the whole thing up by introducing the theory of natural selection, in other words, evolution. And that was a very radical thing to do. He wasn't in danger of execution at that stage, but he was in danger of being very disliked by the establishment because they wanted to believe that the world was 6,000 years old, had been created by God, and the genealogy as written in the Bible was true. In other words, who begat who, and who begat who, and who begat who. And they didn't want their pet theory upset. But Darwin came in and said, well, sorry, I think you're wrong. And then that towards the end of the 1800s, we had a fierce nature versus nurture debate. Are human behaviours instinctual, or are they learnt? From do we become who we are because we've inherited it, or because we were told who we were by our parents and, of course, the rest of our culture? That was a very fierce end of the 20th century. And then appeared, right at the end of the 1800s, Sigmund Freud appeared. And he came up with another radical idea, which was that we have an unconscious mind, and that we can fix ourselves by undergoing psychoanalysis. In other words, whatever's troubling us in our mind, in our behaviour, can be fixed by lying on a couch and talking to some guy who took notes but didn't say a word. And I mean, I won't rubbish it, because it does work for some people. It doesn't work for many, but it did work for some people. So you'll hear me say a lot about that. The old adage, horses for courses. In other words, there's no single psychotherapy or method of improvement, of self-improvement, that works for everybody. Everybody needs a different version, and you'll find out why when we get into evolution and hereditable traits and mutations, and the fact that human beings, there's no two human beings that are identical. Even identical twins aren't completely identical. There are little mutations that make them different. So what works for one person probably will definitely not work for another, have the opposite effect. Okay, now getting back to on track again. And also towards the end of the 1800s, psychology faculties in universities started to appear in Europe and America, which meant they started to treat the study of the mind seriously. And unfortunately, social Darwinism appeared. Now, social Darwinism had nothing to do with Darwin. He would never have subscribed to social Darwinism. And social Darwinism, really what they said was that Darwin taught survival of the fittest. And therefore, the people, like it might be the country or the race or the colour, whatever species, or not species, or the race anyhow, the country or the race, the nation or a particular race are superior to others, and therefore have the right to suppress the others and eventually wipe them out, because that's what evolution is. But what they're really saying that might was right. So they tried to use Darwin's theories as a justification for the what do you call it, the process that's underlined human development, cultural development for a long time now, which is power. You've got the strength and the power. You can overcome anyone who's got something that you want. But what Charles Darwin really said was that it was the people who survived were the people who were able to reproduce more. In other words, it's not about survival of the fittest. It's about the survival of the people who are able to reproduce. And that really is not fitness to overcome other people. It's fitness to live long enough to have babies and to rear them to the point where they can have babies. That's what evolution was about. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the early 1900s. And there was a reaction in Europe, they went with the instinct view, the nature view of things. In the United States, they decided, no, we're going to go with the nurture side. And they developed behaviourism, which meant that, as the founder of behaviourism said, give me a child or a bunch of children under 7 years of age, and I can turn them into anything you want them to be by conditioning, by reward and punishment. And and it doesn't matter who they are, what their family background is. It doesn't matter. I can mold those children into whatever I want. And at the same time, in the early 1900s, neuroscience began to develop seriously. In other words, medical science had developed to the point where they could look at brains and they really had to. They couldn't do like experiments on live brains. They can only look at brains that weren't alive. However, there were sort of natural experiments where a patient would come in who had some particular form of brain damage, and the particular area of his or her brain had been damaged, maybe different for different people. And they looked at how that affected their functioning, their behavior, and their sort of physical functioning by having that area of the brain taken out. So that helped them sort of develop a map of the brain. But mind you, there were a lot of weird and wonderful theories came up. And that was up until the Second World War. And of course, during that time in the United States and in parts of Europe, Freudianism, psychoanalysis was the method of choice for assisting people with mental problems. And in the United States, the method of choice, of course, was behaviourism, conditioning, with by getting people to do things and then give them a reward or a punishment in order to change their behaviour, just like you would training an animal in the zoo to put on a performance. You do it by usually giving them rewards rather than punishments, and it works a treat. However, with human beings, it didn't work. It was an abysmal failure, really. Okay, and in the mid 1900s, just after the Second World War, we began to. Of course, we had the blank slate approach was in favour, and a lot of these developments occurred in the United States, where the blank slate was definitely the flavour of the century. And they developed cognitive approaches. In other words, rather than just behavioural approaches, they decided, well, we'll look at how the thinking process works in people. Of course, they couldn't get inside their skulls too much, but they could look at self-reporting, and they could put electrodes on the outside of the skull to find out which areas of the brain were firing and when and why and how. So that's the cognitive school. Then we had the existential school, which was more along the lines of, well, don't want to say navel gazing, but it really is about self-discovery. So it's about using methods to discover yourself rather than have a trained expert tell you what's wrong with you. So you get in there and you work out for yourself what's going on with the assistance of a person who's trained to assist you do that. However, with the cognitive methods, you sat down with a guy who was the expert, and he did tests with you. And as a result of those tests, he told you what was wrong with you and sent you off to get the appropriate cure. And then also the humanistic ones, which most people know as the Rogerian approach to counselling. And that was a bit of a breakthrough. It's where counsellors stopped advising people, giving them advice, do this, do that, stop doing this, stop doing that, and simply reflecting back to the person what they're saying. In other words, by hearing their own words reflected back in a very nice way, they were able to get a better understanding of what they were saying and why they were saying. And of course, it was sort of treating people with a bit of care rather than as laboratory objects. Okay, so then at the same time, while all that was going on, neuroscience was rapidly developing, mainly because of the introduction of new technology for studying the brain. And more of that later. but we began to get things that eventually developed into the MRIs, and they had a thing called the functional MRI, which meant that they could put a person in this machine and give them mental tests to do, mental tasks, and they could see exactly which portions of the brain were working while that was going on. And they learned a hell of a lot in a short time about how the brain worked. And mind you, all of this was done outside psychology. It had nothing to do with the people who believed that nature was everything. Nurture was everything. That everything was learned. So they didn't want to know anything about this. And that was the second half of the 20th century, up until the 1990s. And during that time, evolutionary biology got into the picture. And a guy called Wilson, E.O. Wilson, was very famous for coming out with some very plausible and subsequently proven true theories about how human beings develop and how our behaviour is largely biologically driven. I won't say totally, just say largely biologically driven. And also neuroscience got into the picture of saying, well, we're not just looking at it from a medical point of view. We're now looking at this from a human behaviour point of view and a human mind point of view. And this kicked off a branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology, which sort of started in the 1990s, about 30 years ago. And that has been developing ever since, and has been using the results, the evidence produced by evolutionary biologists and by neuroscientists during that time. And there's very strong evidence now, thanks to neuroscience and evolutionary biology, that the mind is in the brain. It doesn't exist in a separate non-material substance which hovers around our head or somewhere. It is actually in the brain, and the best evidence for this is if particular portions of the brain are affected in some way by an accident or disease or drugs or whatever it might be, then the mind is affected. In other words, if the mind was elsewhere, how could these things affect the mind? The mind is definitely affected. The mind that starts doing some very strange things once you start fiddling with the networks, the neural networks in the brain. When I say like getting in there and playing around with them, I'm talking about using external means to do it, not internal means. So there's that evidence is growing, and more the blank slate theory is being discredited. In other words, it's becoming not plausible that it's totally due to learning theory, and that everything we are comes from after birth, not from our ancestors. Okay, so that wraps it up for this topic, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Had a few little glitches along the way with things going bip and stuff. But anyhow, I will get the next topic to you pretty soon. Bye for now.